I'm Steve McHarris, your city manager, and I thank you for attending our community budget engagement meeting. Tonight, we want to walk you through some key areas of the budget process to better connect you with the city's operations, services, and items most important to you. We're going to cover the preliminary fiscal year 2023 through 32 10-year general fund financial forecast for the city. And as part of this discussion, we will also review the top line results of our recent FM3 community survey. From the FM3, we already know the city is doing a very good job in serving the community, with the vast majority of residents being satisfied with the overall quality of life in Milpitas, describing Milpitas as safe, and residents are very proud to live here. As for the 10-year budget, we place a very high value in gathering community input to help staff and the city council prioritize funding toward various city services. Right now, we continue to be optimistic about the year ahead. After 2 years of COVID pandemic, we finally lifted the indoor masking mandate for most locations. This is a very good development, but it only works if our community stays vaccinated and boosted. At the local level, it's also great to see that our Milpitas workforce unemployment has dropped to pre-pandemic levels of 2.9% in both December and January. Unfortunately, we've had to add the Russia-Ukraine war to our budget watch list as it impacts the global economy and how it might impact our local Milpitas economy. I also want to point out that the City Council discussed the 10-year financial forecast and desired levels of service on January 25th. So in case you missed it, you might want to take a look at the city accomplishments and City Council priorities discussion in that study session. That's available on our city's website. For tonight, we really look forward to hearing your thoughts. It can be about council priorities or anything that catches your attention from our presentation. Finance Director Lauren Lai has some great information to share with you. So let's jump right into it and have Lauren take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you find this information useful, and we really do look forward to your feedback. If I may get some help with the slide deck, please. Thank you. As the city manager mentioned, this is our community engagement session. We'll be covering the surveys recently conducted and then go over the budget calendars and all the opportunities you'll be able to engage, hear more information about what's happening with our budget and service areas, talk about council priority areas. There are 7 of them. As mentioned, we'll go through a preliminary 10-year forecast, which is a very important tool in our long-term planning. Talk about the federal stimulus funding at the local level, commonly known as ARRA. Talk about Measure F, which is the quarter-cent sales tax, and also talk about the CIP, or Capital Improvement Program, budget that was discussed with council and presented on February 8th, and of course, turn it over to you, which is the purpose of tonight's session. Next slide, please. Community engagement. So we enlisted the service of FM3 to do a statistical survey. It ran from January 3rd to the 17th. It included a survey of adult residents in the city and involved 693 individuals. We did it through telephone, email, postcards. We did it online in multiple languages. High level of confidence with a plus or minus 4% margin. So it's very well done. And I'm looking forward to showing you some of this top line results in the next few slides. Next slide, please. As the city manager mentioned, we're doing really well. We've got some great favorable feedback from the community, starting with 83% are satisfied with the overall quality of life in Milpitas. So that's tremendous. 91% describe Milpitas as accepting. 86 believe Milpitas is safe. That's really important because when we speak about priorities, you'll see that public safety is the #1 priority. So that metric is really important to us. 84% feel that different cultures are celebrated here in Milpitas. 86% are proud to live here. And 68% trust the city to plan for its future. Next slide, please. So key takeaways from the survey is that the perception of life in Milpitas are very positive and consistent in 2021. Large majority continue to feel proud of living here and accepting, and that is accepting and safe, which is super important. However, there is mixed opinions about the city's affordability in the area of housing. Just 2 in 5 now believe the city is growing too fast at 41%, while 45% think it is growing at the right pace. So it's pretty split there. Police, 911 response, and infrastructure continue to be rated as top priorities by our residents. Next slide, please. This exercise was really interesting. We asked those surveyed if they had $100 to budget, hypothetically, amongst 6 council priorities, how would they spend it? Just visually, you could see that it's pretty evenly distributed, right? Not very distinguished. But if you look at the numbers down below, you'll see number 1 is public safety at 22.5 or 22.5, followed by neighborhood and housing at 17, economic development at 16, and the rest is fairly evenly spread with the other 3 areas. This really informs us as we develop our budget and look at how we spend taxpayer dollars amongst service areas. And I'll correlate that for you later tonight when we look at the slides on departments and services. Next slide, please. This slide shows the different ways we hope to engage with you. We will perform surveys through FM3. We have another tool underway called Open Town Hall Survey. It's very short, will only take you a few minutes. It's running live now through April 30th. We'll have 2 of these community budget sessions tonight and April 7th. In addition, our employees are very important to us. We will have engagement opportunities with them and also do surveys as well. We'll have multiple budget study sessions, which you'll see in the slide, and a public hearing as well in going into the adoption of the budget. Next slide, please. We know that accessing you and you accessing us is very important. We are very intentional about using a lot of different channels and methodologies and tools. As you could see there, we have our website. We have multiple platforms of social media. We broadcast on YouTube. We have newsletter for those that prefer it in the newsletter methodology, and then also virtual webinars. So please reach out to us in any or all of these different ways. Next slide, please. So this budget calendaring process is illustrative of kind of the chronology of how we engage, how we develop the budget with community members, with the council, and with the department staff. So as you see there, it begins in January. We've had some preliminary sessions with council already, specifically on January 25th. We presented a preliminary study session with council. On February 8th, we presented the proposed capital improvement program. Here we are at March 10th, where we're engaging with you. We'll have a second session like this on April 7th. We'll come back to council with a few more exercises on the capital budget with the hope of tentatively adopting on May 3rd. We'll have a more robust conversation about the budget, the general fund, and other funds on May 10th with a goal to adopt on June 7th. So lots of opportunities for you, and you could see the chronology of how we approach developing and adopting our budget. Next slide, please. This is what we call our council priority areas. It's really important. There are 7 priority areas. I feel and I'd like to represent this as the pillars of how we make policy and funding decisions, how we translate our tax dollars into services delivered to you. So this is in alphabetical order: community wellness and open space, economic development and job growth, the environment and sustainability, governance and administration, neighborhood and housing, public safety, and transportation and transit. As you may recall in that $sign survey where we did the $100 budget, exercise, it took 6 of these 7 priority areas, and members of the survey spent money in these areas, ranking public safety as number 1. Next slide, please. Great. Now we'll segue over to talk about the preliminary general fund 10-year forecast. The general fund is the main operating fund for the city, which is where we render most of what members think of when they think of city services. Again, we want to emphasize this is preliminary, so we're still in the listening phase, and we'll continue to fine-tune this going into May 10th. Next slide, please. Let's start with the big picture economically. As the city manager said in his opening remarks, there's certain things that we continue to assess, monitor, and it helps inform us in making some assumptions about our financial position and our services. Specifically, we are hopeful about the economic recovery and that we are in a recovery stage. We see that from the health perspective with Omicron peaking and things resuming and going forward in an unmasked state. Also, we see that in some of our numbers and the demand for services in our various service areas as well. When we study what's happening at the state level, we see some consistent information with trends about positive economic forecasts across a number of different metrics, as you could see there on the slide. Locally here, what's really important is our measurement of our labor force, which is a good indicator of our local economics. We definitely have rebounded favorably. As you could see there, at the peak of the pandemic, we had unemployment of 12.9%, but we definitely have recovered now to pre-pandemic level at 2.9%, as the city manager remarked. So that's tremendous for us. Also, as we look at our budget and what's happening in our community, we have to also continue to look at the consumer price index. When we look at the San Francisco area, adjusted for excluding food and energy, it's 5.2%. But what we often hear in the headlines is the all item CPI, which increased to 7.9%, just published by the state. That's as of February, year over year. At the Federal Reserve level, we've all heard about rate increases, so that will affect mortgage rates and the cost of borrowing as well for businesses. And as mentioned by the city manager, the war in Ukraine and Russia definitely is something we will continue to monitor and see how it affects the macroeconomics, fuel costs, and impact us locally. Next slide, please. I want to touch upon where we have come from in terms of COVID economic impact on the city's general fund. It's really important for those that are listening to understand the impact that COVID had on the city. This shows that just high level, the COVID reduced our general fund revenue by $30 million in the span of just 2 years. And that's pretty substantial when our general fund revenue is about $115 million a year. I'm very proud that collectively with the city residents, businesses, council leadership, city staff, we implemented a variety of strategies to solve this problem. As you can see there in the footnote, Measure F, thanks to the voters, we defunded capital projects, we deferred some projects, we had to use contingency reserves in this period of the pandemic. We were creative in transferring funds amongst some flexible funding sources. We've defunded positions and we appreciate the concessions from our employees. And we were helped by one-time revenues as well. So I wanted to just show folks that the pandemic did hit us hard and that we were very strategic and swift in how we responded. Next slide, please. Great. So before we go into looking at the slide about the 10-year forecast, let me just set the table for you as to what it represents. Positively and importantly is that it's structurally balanced, right? Our focus is that we can sustain our service level without going into reserves. It's a preliminary budget because we'll continue to research and monitor and seek feedback. This forecast does not include what we call proposals, which is to enhance services. That is an area that we're continuing to study as we go into May. The forecast also should be noted that it does not easily represent the staff capacity challenges we have in handling services and or new projects. So said differently, at this staffing level, it is very difficult to support taking on new projects. As for the forecast, it also doesn't envision using reserves to balance the budget, which is really important. Reserves have a purpose, and the purpose right now is not to support ongoing services, but maybe for emergency or infrastructure. Very important is our emphasis on economic development, cost management, and innovation and prioritization, especially in light of Measure F expiring, and that we continue to need to be strategic in how we handle our finances and our service delivery. And I'll also touch upon Measure F and ARPA in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So having said all that, how does the general fund look? Well, this is a 10-year forecast starting with the current year, which is fiscal year 21-22 through fiscal year 31-32. What I often like to look at is the annual surplus or deficit. So you could see there we have total source, which is revenue, total use, which is expense, and the difference. The good news is the difference, the annual surplus, is a positive number. It's positive until the anticipated expiration of Measure F. So certainly we'll continue to work hard to ensure that we remain structurally balanced when Measure F expires. But the main takeaway here is that we are in a balanced budget position. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates our revenue sources for the general fund. I think a lot of people may not be aware that in the city where our revenues may come from. As you could see here at the local level, our top two revenue sources, property tax followed by sales tax. The little green extension for sales tax is Measure F. As you can see there, the regular portion is the blue and the green is Measure F. You'll see the sequencing of the revenues followed by license, permits, fees. TOT is our hotel tax, and so forth. So that's a illustration of our revenue source for the city's general fund. We estimate it to be about $116.8 million for fiscal 23. Next slide, please. This is illustrating where we spend the money and provide services with those revenue sources. You could see there that the top two are police and fire. This is an illustration of dollars appropriated or budgeted for fiscal 23 in the different departments. So police, fire, public works, building safety and housing, those are the top ones, and that's really important, and it correlates to the annual surveys that we've been doing. Next slide, please. This shows the departments and the service areas in a different way. It shows it in a pie chart and more as a percentage basis, but same illustration in that you could see the priority areas, which is the large pieces of the pie, really are focused on public safety, public works, building safety, and housing. Next slide, please. I want to take a few minutes here to talk about Measure F. Thank you to all the voters that approved this. It was super timely during the pandemic, and it enabled us to achieve the main reason why we did it, which was to maintain services. It's an 8-year quarter-cent sales tax. It took effect April 1, 2021, and it's scheduled to expire or sunset on April 1, 2029. We estimate it'll be about $6.3 to $6.4 million a year. So that's tremendous considering that our general fund budget is about $115 million. We anticipate it'll grow at about 3% plus or minus in the next several years. So I wanted to just touch upon that to continue to thank the community and demonstrate how important it is to our budget and our general fund services. Next slide, please. Great. The next two slides are going to be about the federal stimulus program, which we call ARPA. The allocation to the city from the federal government is $16.7 million. This is one-time allocation. We have 4 years to spend it. Council in various study sessions and engagements with the community have set up 5 investment areas: community service, economic development, infrastructure, public safety, technology. We have 25 great programs, which really equally distributes these resources. As you could see there, various programs, especially like for rent and mortgage relief, economic development for businesses that have been hit, infrastructure, especially to rehab and repair our parks. If we may have the next slide, please. Public safety to fund fire apparatus and police and fire staffing, and technology, which is really the backbone and infrastructure that enables us to provide direct city services to residents and businesses. Next slide, please. I'm going to now shift to the capital improvement program. So we have the operating budget, which I spoke about, and now we'll talk about the capital improvement program, CIP. This basically funds improvements and enhancements and repairs of capital infrastructure. That could be buildings, streets, roadways, sewer, storm, water systems. As you can see there, we have a 5-year planning tool, and that's really important when we talk about capital projects. We can't just plan 1 year. So a 5-year policy enables us to do better financial and project planning. So over 5 years, we anticipate 137 projects totaling $202 million. We only adopt 1-year budget the first year. And so the other 4 years will continue to be refined, and we will also need to look for funding sources. As noted there in the second bullet point, there is $74 million in this 5-year plan that does not have funding. And that's a really critical takeaway from this discussion as well. Of the 137 projects there, you could see 38% is to streets, 22% is to water, 21% is to sewer. Next slide, please. So in the different categories, you can see in community improvements, we have 14 projects totaling 5.8 million, parks, 4 projects totaling 1.3 million. Important to note here is ARPA will also be infusing $4.3 million to parks. So it's been a very strategic decision by the council to supplement what we could not fund here locally with federal dollars. Streets, 8.5 million, infrastructure for water, sewer, and storm, as you could see below. So the 22-23 proposed budget for capital improvement is almost $30 million. This was presented to council on February 8th. We received feedback from council. We are still in the listening process and refining that. We will continue this engagement with the council in April with the goal of adopting in May. Next slide, please. With that, I want to show you where our funding comes from with capital projects. So unlike the general fund, the capital project is funded by a lot of different sources, such as developer fees, enterprise charges, and enterprise developer fees as well. As you could see there, general government CIP, which is primarily the general fund, is contributing $5 million of the $30 million. TASP is development impact fee, sewer, streets funds, which comes from the state, and also local tax measures, the water fund, and a variety of other funds. So that gives all the individuals here in this community a cross-section of how we finance capital infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Super. In the community projects category, it sounds a little obscure. It's kind of like a catch-all. So we wanted to put this up so you can see kind of the potpourri of projects that are classified as community projects. I want to again emphasize that this is preliminary, that we shared this with the council, and we're still fine-tuning and evaluating the feasibility and whether or not some of these will be adopted. But you could see there's some of the facilities we look towards improving and repairing next year, like such as the fire station, the public safety, computer terminals, and other important infrastructures and facilities. Next slide, please. Parks. Here it's $1.3 million for these various parks. As I mentioned as well, ARPA will infuse $4.3 million across the city's numerous parks that we are planning to repair. Next slide, please. Streets, super important. This shows the different corridors that we're looking at resurfacing and rehabbing and the different funding sources in the last column, totaling $8.5 million. Next slide, please. Now we have our enterprise funds, which are our water and sewer projects. These are really, really important. And so this illustrates the projects we will be hoping to finance and undertake in the next year. Next slide, please. Super. This concludes the staff presentation. Want to put the calendar up again to remind folks all the opportunities. We hope you will listen in and engage. Here we are on March 10th. We'll come back on April 7th and many other times as shown there. And certainly we're just a click away on the internet or a call away on the phone. So we hope to hear from you. With that, it concludes my presentation and I'm going to turn it over to the Assistant City Manager. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lai, and I'm going to look to see if there's questions from the public. I'll facilitate any questions you may have. If you can, if there's any virtual hands, we, again, as Director Lai mentioned, we have several opportunities for you to engage. So if you don't have any questions today, but think of something you want to provide input on, feel free to reach out to us through the survey or through many of the other ways we covered in the presentation. And so we'll just give it a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions. Okay. Well, I think that concludes the meeting. Steve, did you have any final comments?
I don't. I just encourage anybody to tell your neighbors or friends that we have this presentation recorded, and you'll be able to look it up on our website, and then we are all available for you if you have any questions at any time, Monday through Friday during business hours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Mm-hmm.